Hey everyone, it's Alexander, the real Mr. Robinson. So we are a week away from Star Wars The Rise of Skywalker. It comes out next weekend, but I'm actually seeing it this coming Tuesday, so I'm hyped. But we still got a few more movies to go before we eventually get to episode 9. So for today, we're just going to talk about the first two installments of the sequel trilogy, The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi. Because, time's passed. I praised both movies. The Force Awakens made it into my number 1 slot in my best of 2015 list, and The Last Jedi came in at number 4, being beat by The Disaster Artist, Shape of Water, and Coco. But now it's just time to look back at these two movies. And in the time since these two movies have come out, my opinion overall hasn't really changed. There are some things I can look at and go, yeah, that's a bit of a problem, but let's just get into it right now. I might be repeating some stuff that I've already said in my spoiler-free and spoiler-filled reviews for both movies, but without further ado, let's just dive into The Force Awakens. Now, I already said that I prefer the sequel trilogy over the prequel trilogy, and I will die on that hill. And honestly, I don't think it's an unpopular hill to die on. I think amongst the general public, and even a lot of critics, people still prefer these movies over the prequel trilogy. And with The Force Awakens, this is probably one of the most rewatchable movies of the entire saga. Does it borrow plot points from A New Hope? Of course it does. Are there problems with this movie? Absolutely, and I'll get into those problems right now. One of the biggest scenes after rewatching this movie several times that I just don't find myself enjoying as much is the Rathtar scene on Han and Chewie's freighter before they eventually get roped back into this adventure. It's a sequence that, first of all, wastes the Raid actors because they made such a big deal about these guys being in The Force Awakens, and when you see them, you're just like, oh, that's it? Well, that's disappointing. But on top of that, the Rathtars are just not that interesting of a creature. They're just these giant balls with teeth and tentacles. That's some hentai shit right there, but I'm not going to get into that rabbit hole. It's just a sequence that just doesn't feel organic to the plot, and I get its purpose. It's supposed to get Han and Chewie back into this adventure where they're reunited with the Falcon, and they get roped into helping Rey and Finn get BB-8 back to the Resistance. I get it, but I feel like there may have been another way to get these two back into this adventure. And then the other thing I'm not a huge fan of is Starkiller Base. I mean, there's really not a lot to be said about Starkiller Base. It's just another Death Star when you get right down to it. And yes, the movie does address the fact that it's pretty much another Death Star, except bigger, but that's something I just can't give them a pass on this time around because, again, it's another Death Star. I feel like this movie probably would have benefited more, and people would have backed off on comparing this to A New Hope if Starkiller Base had just been a base on a planet. I mean, sure, the climax of destroying a base wouldn't have been as grand or epic as destroying an entire planet, or at least watching it crumble from the inside until it becomes a star, but having it just be another planet killer is just kind of unoriginal. And I just pray to God that there's no Starkiller Base 2 in The Rise of Skywalker. I mean, there were shots in some of the trailers where we saw a giant Starkiller Base type laser, and I hope that's a flashback, because it definitely looks like the same planet that Starkiller Base was established on, but I don't know. Fingers crossed for the best, but if he seriously does another Starkiller Base, then that's going to take some serious points off. But getting back to The Force Awakens, those are honestly the only complaints I have with this movie. Other than that, I still like all these new characters. Poe Dameron unfortunately doesn't get a whole lot to do this time around, but Oscar Isaac is still very charismatic, and you buy Poe as the best pilot in the Resistance. I think John Boyega as Finn is a lot of fun. I absolutely love Daisy Ridley in this movie. She's very charming, she's charismatic, and the chemistry that all these characters have with each other is very good. And Harrison Ford as Han Solo is probably the best he's been since Empire Strikes Back. Because in this movie, he's a more mature Han Solo. He's a Han Solo that's gone through a lot of personal drama, especially considering that, Kylo Ren is his son, and what happened to Kylo Ren turning to the dark side really separated the entire Skywalker family. So there's a lot of tragedy with Han Solo this time around, and I still think his death is very well executed. He's trying to bring his son back to the light, and at first you're just kind of like, man, I hope this all works out. But it just doesn't. And it's a sad scene, but at the very least Han Solo didn't die on some godforsaken freighter hauling a bunch of giant tentacle balls. He died fighting for the Resistance and trying to redeem his son. And speaking of Kylo Ren, I still think Adam Driver does a really good job in this villain role. In this movie alone, I love how he's conflicted by the light and almost wants to stay on the dark side. He's not a true Sith, sure, but that doesn't bother me at all. And there's a lot of seeds planted in terms of what happens next, like with the relationship between Hux and Kylo Ren. They're both at equals, and they're pretty much like two brothers fighting over who's the better one. And I think the film's humor is just spot on as well, and not all of it's in your face. There is the moment where BB-8 pulls out a lighter like he's doing a thumbs up to Finn. I love that moment. I love the little bits with Chewbacca, like when he's talking to the Resistance nurse and the nurse completely understands him. I also love the bits with the bowcaster. There's just a lot in this movie that I just love rewatching it over and over again. And there's even points in this movie where it kind of surprises me. Like when you think about reintroducing the Millennium Falcon, you think it's going to be this slow, grand shot, but no, it just pans to the side after Rey and Finn head towards a quad jumper and claims a ship off camera to just be garbage. Then when the quad jumper blows up, Rey goes, "The garbage will do," and you pan over and it's the Falcon. That's a really nice, quick way to reintroduce the Millennium Falcon. And even Han and Chewie's reintroduction, they just show up. There's no big reveal like showing their shadows or showing their feet and then just slowly panning up. The door of the Falcon opens and boom, they just run right in. Simple as that. So again, I still think The Force Awakens is very entertaining, highly rewatchable, and the fact that Luke Skywalker, the main character of Star Wars altogether, is not in this movie until the very last scene is pretty ballsy in itself, because you'd think that they'd want to have Luke Skywalker be front and center. But no, they've chose to focus on the new characters, and I applaud them for that. And that's the ultimate reason why I think The Force Awakens is different enough from A New Hope to be its own thing. Because when you think about A New Hope, what's the overall goal of that movie? To destroy the Death Star, get the plans back to the Rebel Alliance, and destroy this giant superweapon. In this movie, the superweapon isn't revealed until halfway through, and the main goal of this movie is pretty much a race in who gets to Luke Skywalker first. When the first sentence of this opening crawl came up and it said, "Luke Skywalker has vanished," that's an interesting hook. And again, I just love how he's not in it until the very last scene, and with no dialogue. Again, I might be repeating myself, so you can go watch my spoiler-free and spoiler-filled review of The Force Awakens if you want to know more of my opinion. But this movie, 4 years later, is just as rewatchable as ever. I've seen this movie 6 times in the theaters, and every time I rewatch even little bits of this movie, it's still as entertaining as before. So that's The Force Awakens. Let's move on to Episode 8, The Last Jedi, which, I gotta be honest right now, when I was planning this series of videos, The Last Jedi was the movie that I was honestly dreading to talk about. And not in the way you might think, because again, my opinions on these two movies have not changed, but man, like, in my entire time of being a fan of movies, watching movies, being old enough to discover that other people have opinions, that sounds horrible, but being able to read and watch other people's opinions, or listen to other people's opinions, and eventually getting into the film critic game myself, I have never seen a movie more divisive and filled with so much toxic vitriol than I have with The Last Jedi. I mean, I thought people over-exaggerated when talking about how bad the prequels, Spider-Man 3, and Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull was, but man, with this movie, it's like there's only 2 reactions out there that are heavily projected. It's either you love The Last Jedi and think it's a masterpiece, or you hate The Last Jedi and think it's the absolute worst thing to ever happen to the Star Wars franchise. And look, I have no problem with people disliking the movie. If you do dislike The Last Jedi, or even hate it, then I'm sorry. And that's not a backhanded compliment. Like, I am legitimately sad that you didn't enjoy this movie. But for the love of God, don't attack people who love The Last Jedi. There are so many people out there that think this movie is great. One of them might actually be talking in this very video right now. If you hate The Last Jedi, that's fine. but just respect other people's opinions. I mentioned this in my spoiler review from 2 years ago, but sit down, have a dialogue, have a friendly conversation on why you think The Last Jedi is terrible. If you think The Last Jedi is bad due to things like dialogue, pacing issues, or how certain characters are written, then hey, that's fine, that's your opinion. But don't go in saying that The Last Jedi being terrible is a fact, because it ain't a fact, it's an opinion. Films are opinion-based, goddammit. I'm gonna talk about my feelings on the movie itself, so hang tight. But the one thing that people say that they try to pass off as a criticism of The Last Jedi that I cannot stand is when people say, it subverted my expectations, so therefore I hate this movie. And that's not a criticism at all. To me, that just says you had some fan theories in your head. You had an idea of how this movie played out, and it didn't play out the way you thought it would, or your fan theories never came true. And you cannot say the movie is terrible based off of that. When Infinity War came out, I was let down by the fact that Spider-Man and the Hulk didn't team up. But is that going to make me hate Infinity War? No, because I truly admit that that's something that I wanted to see. And me not getting it, it's sad, but I'm not gonna hate the movie over that one little detail. The same thing with The Last Jedi. Now, if you actually don't like The Last Jedi for what it is, then okay, that's fine. But don't hate on this movie based off your personal wish list and not getting what you wanted to see. So I actually want to apologize right at this moment if I came across like an asshole. I really don't mean it. Again, at the end of the day, if you don't like The Last Jedi, then that's fine. But don't be disrespectful. Don't insult people. Don't call people names. Don't make death threats. Don't be a shithead towards anybody who actually does like this movie. Because, again, those people are out there. And if you can be civil towards those that like The Last Jedi, then you're awesome. But if you can't be civil towards people who like The Last Jedi, then I politely invite you to eat a bag of dicks. Now let's actually talk about my opinions on the movie, because assuming you're still with me, I still think The Last Jedi is great. Does it have its problems? Of course it does, and I've talked about those problems several times beforehand. For one, I don't think the humor works in this movie. I mentioned this in my Knives Out review, but Rian Johnson's humor just doesn't seem to fit well for Star Wars. And while some bits of humor in this movie do make me chuckle, most of this movie's humor makes me cringe the way the humor in the prequels make me cringe. So I'm definitely not arguing with people that think The Last Jedi is not funny, because again, most of the humor doesn't work. The movie does have some pacing issues. Unlike with The Force Awakens, you feel the length with this one, and it's currently the longest Star Wars movie out there. And the Canto Bight stuff is definitely, it's not terrible, but it definitely could have been executed a lot better. But the stuff that is good about this movie, I absolutely love. I think Rian Johnson really did a great job of making this feel like Star Wars, but feel fresh and new. The criticism that people have about this movie subverting expectations, that's one of the things I actually loved about this movie. I loved not knowing where this movie was going to go. I love the twists and turns that this movie takes, like with Luke Skywalker. One of the things I absolutely love about this movie is Mark Hamill's performance as Luke Skywalker, and even Luke Skywalker's journey within this one movie. He's a man who has given up on the old teachings of the Jedi because it's failed him, and it's failed the entire galaxy. The old ways of the Jedi led to the Empire taking over. It led to Anakin Skywalker turning to Darth Vader. It was pretty much the main reason why the Jedi Council was so stupid for not knowing that Darth Sidious was right in front of them the whole time, controlling everything. And it's ultimately the reason why Kylo Ren turned to the dark side. Luke Skywalker wanted to avoid another situation like with Anakin Skywalker becoming Darth Vader. It's that split second where he ignites his lightsaber thinking he could stop it, but then he feels nothing but shame. He is ashamed that he even thought for a second that he could stop the darkness that was looming within Ben Solo by killing him. And because he failed Ben Solo, and because he failed Han and Leia, that's why he's in isolation. One of the biggest themes that a lot of fans and critics love to talk about within Star Wars is how the Force is a metaphor for religion. And in Luke Skywalker's case with this movie, he is somebody who has given up on religion. He is a non-believer at this point. He's cut himself off from the Force. And a lot of people say that that's out of character for Luke Skywalker. Not really, because 30 years between Return of the Jedi and these first two movies is a long time, and in that time gap, people are going to change. Obviously, I am not 30 years old or older, but I can tell you right now that I'm not the same person I was 15 years ago. So Luke Skywalker has obviously changed considering all the tragedy that he's had to endure. And at the end of the day, after reconnecting with Leia through the Force and having a little conversation with Yoda on how failure is the greatest teacher and you can learn from it, he becomes the Luke Skywalker that I loved in Return of the Jedi. He force projects himself onto Krayt, confronts the First Order, confronts Kylo Ren, and stalls them so that the Resistance can escape and be given another fighting chance to defeat the First Order. That right there is an act of self-sacrifice and is the most Jedi thing that any Jedi has ever done. What does a Jedi represent? Not the cool lightsaber action, not using the Force as a superpower. They are the guardians of peace and justice. And that's exactly what Luke Skywalker came in to do. He gave the Resistance a fighting chance to stop the evil that is the First Order and bring peace back to the galaxy. Some people have argued that Luke force projecting himself onto Krayt is a betrayal of the character. And to that, it's just like, okay, that's your opinion, but you entirely missed the point of this whole sequence to begin with. The purpose of this sequence was not to fight the First Order. If it was the purpose, and Luke Skywalker went out there, he would have been dead as soon as that AT-6 blasted him to smithereens. It would have been done right there. But because of his force projection, he managed to stay on Ahch-To while fooling both the Resistance and the First Order, especially Kylo Ren. And he did not give Kylo Ren the satisfaction of killing Luke Skywalker, which has been Ren's entire goal throughout these first two movies. And the fact that Luke died on his own terms, with peace and purpose, does really bring a satisfying conclusion to Luke's story arc throughout these entire movies. And compared to Han Solo's death, Luke Skywalker's death did not sadden me. Because again, as Rey said, he died with peace and purpose. And I just think what they did with Luke Skywalker and with Mark Hamill's performance, it's spectacular. Sure, Mark Hamill was originally against what Rian Johnson did, but using that as an argument for why Luke Skywalker's portrayal was terrible, that's not an argument. And all of the clips that people show of Mark Hamill disagreeing with Rian Johnson are completely taken out of context. Now, getting back to the other characters, the other thing that I really love about Rian Johnson and what he decided to do with this story is that he gave each of the new characters their own story arc. Rey's goal between these two movies is trying to figure out her past. Who are her parents? Where did she come from? Is she connected to somebody important? And the answer to this movie is no. She is not born of lineage. She's just a nobody whose parents left her on Jakku and basically sold her for drinking money. So she has to build up her own legend. I mean, we'll see what The Rise of Skywalker does, but as of now, she's a nobody. And I love how by the end of the movie, she kind of embraces that. Finn, The Force Awakens dealt with Finn trying to run away from the First Order. He didn't want any part of this conflict, and the only reason why he even went to Starkiller Base and helped the Resistance blow it up was just to get Rey back. And throughout most of this movie, he even tries to run away as well, but he agrees to help the Resistance get away. It isn't until he and Rose are captured on Snoke's ship, the Supremacy, and he fights Phasma where he's like, I'm done running. I'm going to stand and fight against the First Order. And he fully declares himself as rebel scum. That itself is a character arc. Poe Dameron, he starts out this movie being cocky and reckless, and while his plan to destroy the First Order Dreadnought is successful, many pilots died during this run, and they lost their entire bombing squad, so he gets demoted. And throughout his failures and his disagreements with Admiral Holdo, he realizes that you can't solve your problems by just jumping into an X-Wing and blowing something up. He realizes that being a leader requires more than that. When it comes to the big finale on Krayt, he realizes that the Resistance alone with their skim speeders can't defeat the First Order, so he orders a full retreat. And by the end of the day, he realizes that the Resistance needs to survive if they're going to continue this fight against the First Order. That itself is a character arc. Kylo Ren. We see him right after he's killed Han Solo and is defeated by Rey, and he is still struggling with inner conflict that he's trying to live up to some sort of legend that Vader had, and realizing that he's being used by Snoke to pretty much replicate Darth Vader again, ultimately leads to one of the best decisions in the movie to kill Snoke off. Snoke was just Palpatine 2.0, and there was nothing really that different about Snoke compared to Palpatine. I mean, when Snoke is using the Force to lift Rey into the air and get the information about Luke's whereabouts, the Emperor's theme plays. If that's not a sign that Snoke is pretty much the Emperor, then I don't know what is. So killing him off was the best possible outcome, especially since we now know the Emperor's back in The Rise of Skywalker. But after killing off Snoke, that really solidifies Kylo Ren in where he wants to go. And rather than turning to the light because of this action, he fully embraces the dark side and eventually becomes Supreme Leader. That is Kylo Ren's story arc within this one movie, and I think it's done expertly. And on top of the story stuff, the way this movie looks and is framed and choreographed in terms of its shots and its action is just amazing. The action scenes in this movie are spectacular. They're tense. They put me on the edge of my seat, especially with the Battle of Crate. Luke Skywalker's confrontation with Kylo Ren is beautifully shot in itself, but even the battle beforehand with the walkers and the skim speeders, just seeing all that red dirt kicked up by the skim speeders is beautiful. This is probably the most beautiful looking Star Wars movie out there, and I love the crimson red color palette that just dominates this entire movie. Like, it is gorgeous, from Snoke's throne room to the dirt on Crate. It's just absolutely a gorgeous movie. I talk about this movie a lot more and in more detail in my spoiler review, so I highly encourage you to go check that out if you've never seen it, because I don't want to fully repeat myself in this video. But with these two movies, I still love them a lot. I still think The Last Jedi is the more well-made movie. It's more bold, it takes risks, it's more surprising, and I love the movie for that. But honestly, I think The Force Awakens has more rewatchability to it. And again, if you don't like these movies, if you don't like the sequel trilogy, that's totally fine. That is your opinion, you are entitled to it, and don't pay attention to what anyone else says. But at least try to understand where people like us are coming from. I love these movies. I think they're great. If you don't agree with me on these movies, but you're respectful towards my opinion, then I'll respect you. So that's all I ask. The one thing I would love to see is this Star Wars fandom just kill its toxic nature. We could debate about the movies and whether they're good or not. And honestly, like, all these Star Wars movies have things that you could complain about, but it ultimately depends on whether or not you can enjoy these movies. Like the original trilogy, I could pinpoint a lot of problems with those movies. As much as I adore them, there are problems in those movies, but it's not going to ruin my enjoyment. Each one of those movies is in my top 20 favorite movies of all time. People who love the prequels, I'll never understand why people love the prequels and think they're better than the sequel trilogy or all the Disney-era Star Wars, but that's their own opinion. There's clearly something in those movies that they see that I don't. I'm not going to rain on their parade for it. And the same thing goes with these newer movies. I think time will ultimately tell what the opinion on the new Disney-era Star Wars is going to be, specifically with the sequel trilogy. We all thought that the prequels were going to be absolutely ridiculed, but they've actually found a new light. Speaking from my own personal experience and from last week's review, rewatching the prequels, they're not as bad as people make them out to be, so I'll be ultimately curious with what happens to the sequel trilogy going forward. Ultimately, it's going to rest on what people think about The Rise of Skywalker. The Rise of Skywalker could be terrible. It could be great. It could be one of those things like Return of the Jedi, where some people don't like Return of the Jedi at all. Some people like it, but admit that it's not as good as the first two movies. Some people, like me, might go, yeah, the first two movies are better, but I still adore this movie. That's how I feel about Return of the Jedi. And The Rise of Skywalker could go down that route. We don't know yet. Nobody has seen the movie yet. I see it Tuesday, so I'm going in with neutral expectations because admittedly, with all of the Star Wars content that Disney is pumping out, Star Wars has kind of lost its magic. But then again, it makes it easier for me to not get overly excited and then see the movie and be let down. So I have no doubt that The Rise of Skywalker is going to be a good movie. And once I see that movie, I will give you my full review as soon as possible and tell you what I think of it. And with all that said, this concludes my 3-part series of the Star Wars Skywalker saga. So now I want to know what you guys think about the sequel trilogy. Do you love the movies? Do you hate the movies? If you do hate the movies, be civil and explain why. Don't be a dick. And again, even if you don't like the movie, if you come across as decent, I will respect your opinion. Just, again, respect mine. But whatever the case may be, let me know in the comments below. And until next time, I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, leave a comment, support my Patreon page, follow me on social media, and until next time, this is the real Mr. Robinson telling you there's only one.